Hey, it's Red Lady Death here, or Rillian Lucifen, or however you know me exactly. I'm recording this right after taking a shower, and I'm kind of bored and a little bit anxious right now, so I was thinking I would make a video going over the lives of the real life 6 wives of Henry VIII, because I know a lot about it. I'm not like a real historian, but I have watched a shit ton of documentaries, lots of podcasts, read some books. Like, I am very familiar with this topic, and I'm a big fan of 6. And I've noticed some people in the fandom, like, don't really seem to be entirely aware of what actually happened. It makes sense because 6 is not really about recounting the events of their lives. So I just want to kind of make a semi-quick video giving you a crash course on what happened, who they all were, what the actual events in their lives were, just so there are no kind of misconceptions. Okay, so in order to kind of set the scene, we've got to go back 400 years to the 12th century. And King Henry I dies without male heir. So he wanted to keep his bloodline going, so he named his daughter Matilda as Queen of England and ordered all his nobles to back her even when he was dead, and they all said they would. And she gets alerted that she's over in Europe, and she's like, okay, I'm coming over. But her cousin, Stephen, is like, hey, I'm the next male descendant. So he goes over to England and he takes over. He's like, I'm king now. And Matilda was a fucking badass, so she's like, no. So she goes to fucking war with Stephen. It's a whole back and forth for decades. Like, she gets the upper hand, she takes London, she's ready to be crowned, but then she gets chased out of London because they're like, oh, she seems like a bitch. So then Stephen takes the crown back, but then Matilda captures Stephen, but Stephen's wife frees him. It's a whole other story. But basically, this all results in the anarchy, as it's called. So that's in the background. Matilda tried to take the crown as a woman. It was a whole big disaster. So next, we're going to skip over another couple hundred years to sort of set the stage for another important piece of backstory for the whole Tudor story. So there's this other king, Richard II, and he's kind of a bastard, kind of fucks around with his nobles, nobody likes him, and his cousin comes in and is like, hey, here's an opportunity. He usurps the crown, takes the crown from Richard, kills him, becomes Henry IV. And this had never happened before in English history. Before then, it had been a peaceful transition of power from father to son, and this caused conflict, because Richard did die childless, but then there are different sides of his family who are like, hey, well, maybe we should be king. So there are Henry IV's descendants, the Lancasters, and the other side of the family, the Yorkists. So Henry IV reigns, dies, his son Henry V comes in, he's a big old war hero, he goes and he conquers France, and there's this huge empire, and everybody loves him, and he dies really young. And his son, Henry VI, kind of is a bad king, nice guy, but yeah. And at this point, because he's a weak king, the Yorkists come in and are like, hey, we can take power, so civil war starts again. And Henry's queen, Margaret of Anjou, who you should learn about because she's fucking awesome, she's kind of leading the charge because Henry's kind of like a bit of a, yeah, just kind of do whatever type of guy. And yet again, there's a huge power back and forth where the Yorkists take the crown and Edward IV is named king, and then he pisses off a noble and the noble helps reinstate Henry, and he takes over again, and then the Yorkists overthrow him again, and it's this whole big disaster and nobody's happy. So that's going on, and then we kind of get to sort of the well-known part of the Wars of the Roses where Edward IV dies, his son becomes Edward V, and his brother, Richard, soon to be Richard III, comes, takes his nephews, and puts them in Tower of London and probably murders him. And everybody's kind of like, yeah, that's not cool, we don't murder kids. So Richard's like on the throne for like 2-3 years, and then a random motherfucker, he's technically a Lancaster, but he's like the half-brother of Henry VI through his mother. It's like, he should not have been king. His name's Henry Tudor. He comes in, he leads a army from France and fights Richard III, and defeats him and becomes king, with a lot of the help of his mother, Margaret Beaufort, who is another badass royal woman, or she wasn't royal technically, but who you should learn about, especially if you like 6. So yeah, Henry Tudor becomes king, and he marries Elizabeth of York, who is the daughter of Edward IV, so unites the 2 branches of the family tree, and forms the Tudor dynasty, which is like supposed to be sort of legitimate, but yeah, probably shouldn't have existed. So this guy, Henry Tudor, he is Henry VIII's dad. Him and Elizabeth of York had a couple children, 2 girls, 2 boys. Now their first son was Arthur. 6 fans will know about him because Aragon mentions him briefly. He's heir to the throne, all their hopes are kind of riding on him, but they also have Henry, so sort of a backup. So Henry VII betroths Arthur to the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the people who sent Christopher Columbus out, like, big deal rulers. They're, like, uniting Spain, they're, like, insane. So they betroth their children. Ferdinand and Isabella send Catherine of Aragon, one of their daughters, over to England, and she gets married to Arthur. Okay, so this is the part that has a bit of contention. They get married, and they go to live together, and everyone kind of expects that they will consummate their marriage, i.e., like, do the do. So they have their wedding night, and Arthur comes down and he's like, oh yeah, I was in Spain last night. And Catherine, I don't think really says anything. And then, 6 months down the line, some unknown illness comes, hits the castle they're at, and both of them get sick, but Arthur dies, Catherine recovers. So now they're kind of in a weird situation because the heir to the throne is dead, and now they have this Spanish princess sitting here, and they're like, what do we do with her? Her parents kind of want to send her back, they also want to keep the alliance. Henry VII is being kind of like a bastard, they're both screwing each other, and Aragon's just stuck in England like, what is going on? And she's not really being taken care of. It got to a point where she was so poor that she had to sell her, like, jewelry and cutlery and stuff. She was not having a good time. Those are the 7 years that she's talking about in her little pre-No Wayne monologue. Henry VII is kind of like, okay, I want this alliance. My wife just died. Maybe I could marry this 16-year-old girl? And everyone's like, no, that was your son's wife, and she's also a child, and you're like 50. And it's like, okay, well, maybe we can marry Henry to her, and Henry is like 12, so he doesn't really have much of a say in this. 7 years go on, and eventually Henry VII dies. And Henry VIII comes out after his father dies and is like, his dying wish was for me to marry Catherine of Aragon. Probably wasn't. Henry probably just wanted to do what he wanted. Because he knew Aragon, she was very pretty, she had a lot of good stuff going for her politically, and yeah, he just wanted to. So they got married. The whole she was his dead brother's wife thing was like, okay, is this allowed? But like they went to the Pope and the Pope's like, yeah, it's cool, because the Pope was supposed to sort of make sure everything was holy, but he could be bought out really easily. So Henry and Aragon get married, and they're pretty happy. Like, Aragon's like finally living the life she was meant to live. Henry is really popular because he's young, he's handsome, his father kind of had a bad reputation for being kind of like stingy, and Henry's just like, yeah, party time. And he's also very fixated on, hey, I want to be like Henry V, the guy who like conquered France, and like, I want to be a big war hero. So yeah, Henry and Catherine are doing that for a few years. Henry at one point does go off and tries to fight in France, and while he's out there, there's a revolt in Scotland, and Aragon's left there. She's the regent while he's gone, so she's in charge, and she, depending on who you ask, she either like led the battle against him, or just kind of oversaw the battle that killed the Scottish king. And yeah, she kind of ended up outshining Henry's stuff in France because it was like, oh, he took like a minor town and then got kind of betrayed by his allies, and she led the battle that killed the king of one of England's great enemies. So that was kind of like a moment, but still things are okay. So Henry and Catherine are married for 20-ish years, and Catherine gets pregnant a lot. But the issue was she had a very hard time both carrying kids into term or like giving birth to healthy children. They had one son who lived for like 50 days and then died suddenly. There were a lot of miscarriages. It was just pretty terrible. And at the time, fertility was seen as like a sign of holiness or favor from God. So the fact that Aragon, even though she was quite a popular queen, she did all the sort of right things. She was like patron of the arts. She encouraged like education for women, like appropriate education for women. That's like, Peyton will remember that. Yeah, she did everything right. She was a great queen, but she could not give Henry a son. And that was, or any living children for that matter. And people were kind of like, huh. And eventually, Catherine does give birth to a healthy child, but it's a girl. Mary I, Bloody Mary, however you know her. So, Henry, him and Catherine sort of are getting up there. Catherine, she stops being able to give birth. And Henry's like, shit, I can't make Mary my successor because look at the shit that happened with Matilda when she tried to take power. It was a whole civil war, and we're just coming off a civil war. Plus, my dad has basically no right to the throne other than right of conquest. So, like, I can't leave the succession so shaky, or else England's gonna dive into another civil war. So, that's the issue. What happens then is, over from France comes Anne Boleyn. She was mid-20s, not that pretty apparently, like she was like normal looking, but very intelligent girl who had been raised in the courts of Europe for most of her life and had received a very good education. She was known for being like very witty, very like politically astute, which is why people really don't like the whole politics, not my thing line. Anne Boleyn was like a very smart, alluring person. So she comes over, and she very quickly becomes, like, very popular in court, because she's just a cool lady, and she's very fashionable and smart and fun to be around. And so she catches Henry's eye. Now, Henry had already slept with her sister. He had taken her sister Mary as a mistress. And he's like, oh, I like this chick. I'm gonna ask if she will be my mistress, too. So he does. But Anne's like, no. And that's kind of a big deal because, like, no one had ever said no to Henry before, especially when it comes to, like, sex. And instead of getting mad, he's kind of allured by this. He's like, huh, like, I'm gonna, like, oh, she's playing hard to get, huh? So he kind of ends up chasing her, and Boleyn's just like, no, no, no. But at the same time, her interest level is a little hard to gauge because there's this whole thing called courtly love where women of the court were supposed to sort of flirt with guys but also sort of like reject them. That was normal, especially in France where Boleyn had grown up. Again, we don't really know because we don't have her responses to his letters. So we don't know if it was like, leave me alone, or like, oh, yeah, that didn't, like, the sort of how Six portrays it, like the XO baby. But yeah. Someone described it very well where it's like, it's not clear if this was a, like, ooh, courtly love situation or a medieval Me Too situation. Either interpretation is valid, I suppose, because we will never know the truth. But yeah, so Henry's sending her all these love letters, and she's like kind of rejecting him, being like, I'm not gonna sleep with anybody until I'm married. Boleyn was also, as a side note, sort of engaged at the time to like this guy called Henry Percy. Don't know a whole ton about them, but the engagement kind of got broken up. Again, depending on who you ask, it's either it just fell apart on its own because of like political reasons, or Henry broke them up because he wanted to get with Boleyn. So eventually, with all this badgering going on from Henry, like, she's like, I'm not gonna sleep with you unless I'm your wife. And that would require him to divorce Catherine of Aragon, which was kind of like, well, that's not done. Like, she hasn't done anything, and that doesn't happen between kings and queens generally. Verse also, well, there was kind of trouble in paradise. Aragon and Henry were not so much not getting along, but the whole no heirs thing was a bit of a strain on the marriage. And also, something to note that is very important to the story, religion. At the time, Protestantism as an idea started off in Germany, was starting to spread, Anne Boleyn was a Protestant, or sort of held reformist ideals. And some people think she could have introduced Henry to some of the ideas of Protestantism, where like, oh, maybe the Pope isn't the end-all be-all, and maybe kings should be the ones to dictate religious matters in their country. And Henry, being a huge fucking narcissist, was like, oh yeah. So now it's kind of like, okay, let's figure out how we're gonna do this. So there's this passage in the Bible, in Leviticus, where all the best Bible verses come from, that says, if a man marries his brother's wife, they will be childless, it's an unclean thing, yada yada yada. Even though apparently there's another passage in the Bible that requires men to, like, marry their brother's widows or some, I don't know. So Henry latches onto that. It either could have been completely selfish motivations, like, oh yeah, there's a reason I can get rid of Aragon, or he could have legit thought, like, yes, this is true, even though, you know, he already had a child with her, but he's like, well, Mary doesn't count. So eventually he passes this off to his lawyers, and they're like all like trying to figure out the legality of this, and eventually like Aragon catches wind, and she's like, what? Because again, she's not done anything wrong, really. She just hasn't had any children, and she really does love Henry. Like, I don't think she really had much of a choice otherwise, but yeah, it's like, why are you treating me like this? And this is the beginning of a 7-year-long legal battle between Henry and Catherine, where Henry's trying to divorce her because he's like, you are the wife of my brother, and like, you slept with him, and therefore our marriage is invalid. And she's like, I didn't sleep with your brother. Like, we were teenagers and he couldn't, like, perform. So, big back and forth on that. At one point, they literally go to court with a bunch of, like, citizens, I think, or maybe they were nobles, like, watching. And that's where Aragon gives her Blackfriars speech, the part of No Way, where she, like, you got me down on my knees, please tell me what you think I've done wrong? Like, that whole segment where she just kind of implores Henry, like, I have not done anything wrong, God has chosen to take our children from us, but I have been your true wife, all that stuff. And after doing that, she gets up and just walks out of the court. And the, like, bailiff is just like, Catherine, Queen of England, come back into the court, and she just walks the fuck out, embarrassing Henry in front of, like, all these people. While this is all going on for 7 years, Henry is still attached to Anne Boleyn. However, they're not having sex, because, like, Anne's just like, I'm not doing this unless you marry me. But Anne, for all intents and purposes, kind of becomes the queen. Henry kind of starts pushing Catherine further and further out of power and putting Anne sort of in her place. Catherine's fighting it every step of the way. Anne's fighting back. It's a long time. And eventually, Anne's starting to get kind of impatient because she's about to turn 30, and she's like, I'd like to get married before I stop being able to have kids. So eventually, Henry just blows up relationships with Rome, the Pope, and everything, and it's like, fuck it, I'm in charge of religious matters in England now. So yeah, he takes power, he's trying to, like, work all this stuff out. Oh, important thing to notice, the Pope was kind of, at first, they were, like, trying to ask him, like, okay, what's your opinion on this? But the Pope couldn't really give a clear answer because at the time he was being besieged by Catherine's nephew. He kind of had the Pope as his hostage, so the Pope was like, can't really give an answer on this. Probably would have said no anyway, but he was like, no, you cannot get divorced from her. Your marriage with her was valid. So, again, Henry just kind of blows up relationships and decides, like, Church of England. I can grant myself a divorce. Me and Catherine, we are done. And yeah, he kind of sends Catherine away to a series of shitty castles that were kind of bad for her health. She never went to a nunnery. That was a deal that was offered to her that's like, oh, well, if you agree to annul your marriage with Henry, you can move into a nunnery, because you're quite religious, you might enjoy that. And she's like, no, I'm the queen. And there's also, well, you could live as the Princess Dowager, because that marriage was valid, and you and your daughter could still live in peace and luxury and everything. And she's like, no, my marriage was valid and I'm not gonna let Mary become a bastard, basically cutting her off from her rights. So yeah, just no way. So Henry just fucking one day, they're all in a castle together. Henry takes everybody else and fucking leaves Catherine behind in the castle, and again moves her around to a bunch of different ones. And she was kind of old by Tudor standards. She was like 50, and her health started to decline. Meanwhile, Henry and Anne are coming back from France. The divorce is pretty much all finalized, so Anne's like, yeah, you can sleep with me. They do the do. Anne gets pregnant. So very quickly afterwards they're like, okay, we gotta get married and we gotta crown you queen because we don't want our child's, our sons, because they were so sure it was gonna be a son, son's legitimacy to be in question. So they do all that real quickly. The English population is just like, what is going, excuse me? Like, why are we being excommunicated? Where is Catherine? Why is this woman our queen now? Like, a lot of misogyny gets thrown Boleyn's way. Yeah, it's a whole thing. So a couple months later, Anne gives birth. It's Queen Elizabeth I. But they didn't know it was Queen Elizabeth I. It's just like, okay, that's a girl. Not what we were looking for, but okay. Because this is like a thing. Like, a lot of people are like, oh, Henry saw Elizabeth as a disappointment. It's like, well, yes, but the sort of outlook was like, oh, well, we're young, we can have more kids at first. So for like 3 years, Boleyn's queen, things are okay. Catherine of Aragon's still alive, just locked up in a palace somewhere. Boleyn's kind of trying to do all the normal queenly things. She's giving to the poor, she's organizing a big, fashionable, extravagant court. She's kind of doing the not normally queenly thing of sort of whispering in Henry's ear and kind of being like, hey, let's do this in terms of like religious reform and everything, and like, hey, we could do this with France and make these marriage alliances and everything. And she's also trying to get Mary to like acknowledge that she's a bastard and that Anne's queen now, and Mary, taking after her mother, is like, no, fuck you, I hate you. So yeah, that goes on for a couple years. And Anne is also getting pregnant like 3 times. She's pregnant, and then she miscarries. Just like, oh. Then there's another time she gets pregnant. Henry's out jousting, gets knocked off his horse, has the horse fall on him, and is unconscious for 2 hours. And the shock of that makes Anne miscarry again. And at this point, Henry's like, huh. So, yeah. And Henry was accustomed to sort of being able to do whatever he wanted extramaritally. So it's like, yeah, I can take mistresses, so what? He preferred taking them when his wives were, like, pregnant or in confinement, because that was a whole thing in the Tudor era where they just, women in the, like, last months of their pregnancy would just, like, go into a room and not come out, just go into a cocoon, pretty much, until they gave birth. And Anne was not into the idea of Henry, like, sleeping around, as she says in the show. He's, like, sleeping with her cousin, he's starting to, like, try and court Jane Seymour, who's Anne's lady-in-waiting, and Anne's just not having it, because it's like, what the hell, you moved heaven and earth, you changed the country's religion to marry me, and now you're doing this? Like, I'm your wife. And Henry's not accustomed to that, because Aragon, when they were married, she would just kind of put up with it. Like, she was very aware that he was sleeping with, like, a lot of her ladies-in-waiting and, like, other people. But it's like, that's what's normal for a king in this era. Okay. Again, as she said in the show, okay, 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 no way. But yeah. So, Anne's not having it, and as far as we know, this just kind of led to her, like, yeah, her and Henry having a couple fights. But, at this point, Henry's not really into Anne anymore because, well, he's had sex with her, and she's not fun anymore. Now she's, like, telling him what to do, and she's not giving him sons, and she's not letting him sleep around. So he starts to turn against her. And his sort of right-hand man, one of his ministers, Thomas Cromwell, who had previously helped Anne sort of get into power, because she's a Protestant, he's a Protestant, he was kind of worried that Anne was going to turn on him, so he turned on her first. He kind of took advantage of the sort of rocky relationship between them and built up this whole case against Anne, where it's like, okay, she's been sleeping around. She's been sleeping with her musician, with these men of the court who are like Henry's friends, and her own brother. And there was basically no evidence for any of this, but yeah, they took the musician guy, Mark Smeaton, tortured him until he confessed, then arrested the other guys, interrogated them, and then after a while, like, Anne's kind of like, what's going on? And then she gets arrested. She gets brought to the Tower of London, and doesn't really know the charges against her, but is, like, scared out of her mind. Like, why am I being arrested? What is he doing? What's happening? And then she goes on trial, and they read out all the accusations against her, and she defends herself well. She's like, of course I haven't slept with my brother, or any of these other guys. We were in completely different places on the dates you're accusing me of sleeping with them on. But it was kind of, there was no helping it. Like, the jury was filled with men loyal to the king. It was a foregone conclusion. And she probably knew this, but she still defended herself anyway. And did it very well. So, of course, they passed down judgment that she's guilty, and the punishment for cheating on the king is burning at the stake. And also, she was never married to the king, actually, because she was pre-contracted to that guy that Henry may have broken up her engagement with. So that also made her daughter, Elizabeth, with Henry, she's also a bastard. So everything Anne worked for just comes crumbling down. And after a couple days of coming to terms with that, maybe watching her brother and the other guys get their heads chopped off, Henry commutes her sentence to beheading instead of being burnt at the stake because it's less painful. And he also, he brought in a fancy French swordsman to do the job because that's less painful than an axe, in his infinite generosity. After that, Anne gives a speech, and gets beheaded, and dumped in an unmarked grave in the Tower of London. And I think that day, Henry announced that he was going to marry Jane Seymour. Or maybe he got married to Jane Seymour on that date. I'm not good with dates. So, Jane Seymour. She was the daughter of somewhat important noble family. She had a way more traditional upbringing than Aragon or Boleyn, who were both pretty well-educated, like, feisty women. Seymour grew up learning the domestic stuff. She could kind of read, but not really. Learned how to do needlework, like, all that normal stuff, and was kind of expected to just marry and, yeah, be normal. Now, she initially served as waiting to Aragon, then Boleyn came in, she worked for her. At one point she went home, and then I think she came back. It was weird. And while she's there as Anne Boleyn's lady-in-waiting, Henry starts to notice her, and he's like, hey, here are some gifts, want to be my mistress? And Seymour pulls the same thing Boleyn did, where she's like, I'm not going to be romantically involved with anyone until I'm married. And Seymour, like, we don't know a whole ton about her because there aren't a lot of records and she died very quickly after becoming queen. So there's a little bit of a discussion around, like, was she really, like, this pure, innocent, like, cinnamon roll? Or was she a bit more of a Boleyn type? Like, a little more cunning, willing to do shit. We don't really know. And we probably never will. But yeah, she's like, I'm not going to accept your affections unless I'm married. And Henry falls for the same shit twice, and he just gets more and more attached to Seymour. And when Boleyn gets arrested and gets executed and everything, he just immediately goes in and is like, this is the new woman I am going to marry, and they get married immediately after Anne gets executed. And people are kind of unsure as to why he picked Jane, because Jane was just kind of like she wasn't exceptionally beautiful, she wasn't exceptionally witty, which was kind of Henry's type. Like, she was just kind of a very normal person. But they kind of like, okay, whatever. And her family, of course, takes advantage of the marriage and starts accruing positions of power. And Seymour, like, in general, seems like a decent enough person. Like, she did all the normal queenly things. She kind of made peace with Mary, like, because Mary was kind of banished at the time. Like, not officially, but, like, yeah. And she's like, okay, well, I agree with you secretly, because Seymour was a Catholic, and she sympathized, like, she did not like Anne Boleyn. She's like, okay, I sympathize with you, but if you want to get anything back, if you want to stop being banished, basically, like, you gotta make some concessions to your father, and Mary eventually did, and she was kind of accepted back into court life. So, yeah, Seymour, she kind of reconciled them a little bit, and yeah, she was just kind of a normal medieval Renaissance queen. There was one instance where there was this big Catholic uprising that Henry had to squash, and there was sort of the question of, well, what are we going to do with the people who rebelled? And of course the answer was kill them all, but Seymour's kind of like, could you maybe not do that? Like, they really did think they were doing the right thing. And again, she's a Catholic, so she sympathizes, and Henry's like, you would do well not to meddle in my affairs, or you might go the same way as your predecessor. And after that, Seymour didn't do anything else, because, yeah, Henry basically threatened her with death. So, they're married for like 18 months, pretty short time. Seymour doesn't immediately get pregnant. People are like, but eventually she does. She goes into confinement, and she has a really hard birth. Her son, Edward, I don't think was positioned properly in her womb, so her labor lasted days. But eventually he was born, he's healthy, it's a prince, big celebration all throughout the land. Henry is overjoyed. And fun fact, Edward VI, her son, was born on my birthday, October 12th, which I think is cool. So Seymour's like, she's okay, like she's obviously very tired because she'd been in labor for 3 days. But she's alive. She attends Edward's baptizing, but then her health starts to decline. Because back in Tudor ages, they didn't know a whole lot about medical things and cleanliness and everything, and it's thought she sustained an infection. And she died, eventually, after 2 weeks. And Henry was pretty, like, torn up about it. He did go into mourning, he took to his chambers and wouldn't let anybody in for like 3 days straight. It was a big thing. Okay, so now he's done what he wanted to do. He has a son. But at the time, the common knowledge was, well, if you're a king or whatever, you gotta have an heir and a spare. You gotta have the firstborn son and your second son, just in case the first one dies, as had happened with Henry. His older brother was meant to be king, but he died, and that made room for Henry. So, even though Henry wasn't super into, like, remarrying, because he was, like, legitimately mourning Seymour, a lot of his advisors are like, hey, you probably should get married again, and hey, maybe you should marry a foreign bride this time, just because, well, you blew up relations with Rome, so now, like, we kind of need to, you know, make some political alliances so we don't get fucking invaded or anything. Like, yeah, let's do something. And Henry's like, okay. So they start looking around Europe for a potential bride. Henry gets very attached to this girl, Christina of Denmark. She was like a teenager. He thought she was pretty. She was, like, not having it at all. She's like, all 3 of his wives ended up dead. No thanks. There's a famous quote attributed to her where it's like, if I had 2 heads, one of them would be at the King of England's disposal. So that kind of fell through. So eventually, Cleaves, duchy in Germany, comes to the advisor's attention because, hey, this kingdom is part of, like, a Protestant league, and marrying one of their daughters could be advantageous politically. So they look into them, and eventually Henry sends over Hans Holbein over to paint the girls' pictures. He was looking at 2 sisters of the reigning duke, Anna and Amalia. He sketched them, took their likeness, sent it back to England, and Henry sort of looks, and he's like, I like that one, I like Anna. And it's like, okay, bring her over. Now, Anna of Cleaves, who is my personal favorite, in both 6 and in real life, she was kind of similar to Seymour in that she had a more traditional medieval upbringing where, like, she wasn't super well educated. She was taught, like, she was good at needlework, or no, she hated needlework, but she was sort of more educated in the domestic and brought up to be, like, a wife. So Cleaves is just a very chill person. She gets brought over, she's pretty excited, she's like, hey, I'm gonna be queen! She's doing her damn best. She's like, oh, like, asking the advisors, like, oh, is there anything about England that I should know? Like, teach me the customs, and what are games that the king likes to play so I can learn how to do them and everything. She's just so, like, she's really game. So, she comes on over, and she's scheduled to meet Henry on New Year's Eve, I think, in London, I think. But Henry does not want to wait, because he's gotten all excited about Anna. He's like, I want to see her now. And Henry, he liked to dress up. He had this thing with Catherine of Aragon, where him and his friends would dress up as, like, robes and cloaks and everything, and they would break in on the ladies, and the ladies, even though they knew who the guys were, they would act all confused, but still, like, gracious, and then they would reveal their true identities, and everyone would clap. Yeah, it's very silly. But this wasn't really a thing in Germany. So Henry is like, let's do it! So he goes and rides up to where Anna is staying for the night to meet her, like, a week or so before they were supposed to meet. So Anna does not speak a word of English. She's kind of sitting, she's watching, apparently bull baiting or bear baiting, one of the two, out in the yard. And then this big old man comes in, dressed as a servant, and is way overly friendly with her, like, kisses her, is, like, kind of, like, it's just very inappropriate. And she has no idea what's going on, because this was not a custom in Germany, and she doesn't speak a word of English. So I assume the communications are going through, like, a translator. So she's just kind of like, what? And doesn't realize that this is the fucking king. And reacts like anyone would when a frankly, like, ugly stranger comes and starts being, like, overly familiar with you. It's kind of like, okay, like, she kind of blows him off a little bit. And Henry was expecting her to instinctively know that this was her betrothed and to act accordingly and it all to play out well. Henry was kind of delusional. He hadn't really accepted the fact that he was, like, a fat old man at this point. So, yeah. He leaves the room, he comes back in dressed in his kingly attire, and Cleaves is like, and they're, like, polite to each other, and then Henry goes out again, and he's like, what the hell is this? What, like, he's like, I don't like her. And he starts throwing around all this stuff. He's like, she smells, she's ugly, she's fat, all this stuff that was actually true about him. But yeah, it's like, it's her fault. He just decided Anna was no good because she embarrassed him, kind of. Entirely by accident, but yeah. So they go back to London, and Henry is just desperately trying to break up the marriage before it even starts. So they're going back and forth with the German ambassadors, like, oh, so Anna was engaged to a duke back when she was, like, 11, right? And they're like, well, it was really informal and it never went through, so, like, yeah. And they're like, where's the documentation? And they're like, well, we didn't bring it. And it's like, but they can't stall forever, and eventually the wedding day comes, and Henry's just like, fuck. And Anna's like, okay, well, we're doing this. I don't think she knew that all this stuff was happening behind the scenes, but yeah, her and Henry get married, they have their wedding night, they go to bed together, and of course we don't really know what happened, but Henry comes out the next morning just like, oh, I didn't like her before, but now I like her even less. And Anna, and she's not talking because that would be inappropriate for a woman to do in the first place, but also she doesn't speak any English, so she can't exactly, like, gossip with her ladies-in-waiting. So yeah, Henry and Anna are married for 6 months. Everyone is being kind of a dick to her. like, behind her back. Cleaves is trying her damn best, like, she's learning English, she's like, oh, well, people don't like how I dress, okay, I'll dress in the English fashion or the French fashion. She's being a good stepmother, Cleaves is like a nice lady. She's like the nicest, most normal person out of all 6 wives, and that's why I love her. But meanwhile, Henry and his, like, lawyers and everything are trying to break up the marriage, plus Henry has gotten interested in this lady-in-waiting of Anna's, Catherine Howard. So that's kind of going on, and the court, because they kind of have to listen to the king, and like, if he says the sky's green, we gotta say the sky's green. So if he's like, I fucking hate Anna, like, they gotta be like, we fucking hate Anna. So they're kind of talking behind her back, and they all kind of agree, like, oh yeah, she's ugly, even though people who weren't affiliated with the English court is like, yeah, she's fine, she's pretty, or maybe not like a knockout, but she's not ugly. So eventually, 6 months down the line, they get to a point in the legal process where they're like, okay, well, we can say Cleaves was pre-contracted and therefore the marriage is invalid and Henry's free to marry again. And they're like, okay, we're doing this. And they send a letter off to Cleaves and they're like, this is what we want to do. And she's just like, at first she's like, what? Like, that's not what happened. I'm not pre-contracted. Like, I'm his wife. And then the next day, after mulling it over and, you know, remembering how he treated Aragon and Boleyn, she's like, you know what? Okay, I'm gonna agree to this. And Henry, he's like, oh my god, I wasn't expecting this. And he gives Anna a super generous divorce settlement. He's like, your new title is the Queen's sister, you'll still be part of the royal family, you can have these palaces that used to belong to Anne Boleyn, like, you get the works. You just gotta agree that you were never my wife. And Anna is kind of like, okay, I'll take it. She wasn't, like, wild about it, but it's like, okay, better to have this happen than be decapitated. So, yeah, that happened. And she's like, okay. And Anna goes off and lives her life. After that, Thomas Cromwell, the guy who kind of arranged the Cleaves match, gets arrested and executed for treason. Thomas Cromwell's a whole other story there. And the day he gets executed, Henry marries Catherine Howard. Now, Catherine Howard was about 16 or 17 when she got married. Catherine was the daughter of a noble family. She's Anne Boleyn's cousin. And her father was kind of like a shitlord. Was constantly in debt and eventually just kind of sent her to live with her step-grandmother, his stepmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. And the Dowager Duchess sort of had a lot of other kids living with her. She kind of ran a finishing school for noble children. And the issue was she was not very good at it. She kind of let whatever happen. There was a lot of sex going on, basically. And Howard, I think, arrived when she was like 6 or like maybe 10. And that was the environment she was growing up in, where everybody was having sex with each other behind the Duchess's back. And at age 13, she gets a new music teacher, Henry Mannix. And he is either 23 or 35. We're not entirely sure, because he was just a musician, so no one really recorded his date of birth. And they begin a relationship. Yeah. It's unclear how much was Kitty being, 13 and being like, oh my god, like, an older man's giving me attention, and oh my god, maybe this is, being love-struck. Maybe it was straight up like, I don't want this to happen, but, like, we have no idea. So that happened, relationship goes on for a while, and eventually I think they, like, kind of break up, because Howard's kind of like, well, I'm, like, a noblewoman, and you're, like, not, so this can't go anywhere anyway. And then, a couple years later, she's 15, she gets involved with another guy, Francis Derham. He works in the household, and they seem to be very into each other. They called each other husband and wife, very into each other. And again, Derham was probably in his 20s at the time, so still pedophilia. But yeah, Catherine seems more enthusiastic about this one. As far as the evidence goes, again, we don't really know her actual feelings on any of these men. So that's going on, and eventually Catherine's step-grandmother discovers that they're in a relationship, and she's like, no, this is not allowed, this is inappropriate. She somehow didn't know that all these sexcapades were going on even in her own household. She was just not good at caring for children. So she sends Derm away, and Derm's like, wait for me, and Catherine's like, okay. So after that, her uncle, who is a major player in court, takes notice of her, and it's like, huh, well, maybe it'd be a good idea to sort of bring her to court and have her in the Queen's household, in Cleaves' household, just so we'll have, like, someone who's on Howard's side. So he secures Catherine a place in court, and she's really into it, because, like, she's a teenager, and she's like, oh my god, this is all so cool, like, this is so much fun, this is all the stuff I like doing, I like dancing, I like kind of flirting with guys, having a good time, this is wonderful. And eventually, she catches Henry's eye. And I believe they did have sex before getting married. Catherine was no Boleyn. Like, she did not have, like, the political instincts of Boleyn. And it's like, she was a fucking child. Of course she didn't. So I think when the king's like, I want to have sex with you, she kind of like, okay. We don't know a lot about Catherine Howard. Her story is very informed by emotions, and we don't have a lot of evidence of them. So we gotta make a lot of inferences. May have been excited about it because, oh my god, it's the king. May have been highly uncomfortable because this man could be her father, and at this point is disgusting. I don't know how much he weighed, but a lot. He was a very tall guy too, so he was like 3 times her size, just overall. He had oozing leg ulcers, gout, just Henry was not doing good at that point. So yeah, they have their little affair, and Henry, who's not into his marriage with Anna to begin with, doesn't really need a lot of persuading to be like, okay, I'm gonna divorce her and then get with this new little child that I'm sleeping with. So he divorces Anna. Anna's like, okay, and Catherine becomes queen now. She was queen for like a year or two, and she did like an okay job. Again, she's a teenager, so there wasn't a whole ton she did in terms of like charity and like queenly stuff. She was mostly like, let's have fun. Henry's showering me with gifts, so yeah, let's just do that. And she kind of made Henry feel young again, and they were having lots of sex. This tiny little 17, 18-year-old with this 50-something man who's like 400 pounds and like 6'3". Yeah, probably not a good time. But she's overall enjoying her time as queen. Then eventually she starts getting letters from people who used to live with her at her step-grandmother's house, being like, hey, I'm so happy that you're in this position. Maybe you could find a place for me, too, in your household. And under there's a little bit of the threat that, hey, I know your past. How about you, do a little something for me so I don't let that slip. So either out of like, oh, I'd love to have my old friends with me, or like, I don't want them to say anything. She starts bringing old associates from hers into her household, making them like servants and everything. And Francis Dearham even gets in on that, where he's like, I want to be your secretary. And she's like, okay. Yeah. So Catherine's kind of in a snake pit right now, because she's the figurehead of the Howards. The Howards have a bunch of enemies who are looking to take them down and therefore take her down. She's got all these people who know about her past, and it's like, yeah. Eventually, a new sort of relationship starts up, because Henry's not feeling great. He's physically ill. He, like, locks her out of his apartments and everything, and there's this guy, Thomas Culpeper, who is, like, a good friend of the king's, who she was interested in back when she was lady-in-waiting, and he's kind of shown interest in her. And one of her ladies-in-waiting, Jane Parker Boleyn, who was Boleyn's brother's wife, who also gave evidence against them in court. She was one of the ones to accuse them of incest. She's there and she's like, hey, I'll set up these meetings between you and him so like you guys can like get to know each other or whatever. And so that happens and they start meeting in secret. And they could have just been flirting or they could have been having sex. One of the two. So that's going on, this little secret affair, and they're both acting like kind of brazenly, like Culpeper's like strutting around like he owns the place, and Catherine like wrote him a couple love letters, one of which survives. That's how we have her signature. And it's like, maybe don't put that in writing, but yeah. So that's going on, and eventually this information gets into the hands of some of the Howard's enemies, who present that information to Henry, and at first Henry's like, I don't know, that can't be true, not my Catherine. But he's like, also investigate this. And they investigate this, and they're just turning up all this shit in Catherine's past, and they're abducting people and torturing them into confessions and everything, and then eventually Catherine is arrested, and she's terrified. She's like making all these pleas. She's trying desperately like to save her life. During her questioning, at that time, like, Culpepper hadn't been implicated. She accidentally implicates him during her confession. Like, it's a whole, yeah, it's terrible. Once she's questioned, she's just fucking condemned. So they send her to the tower. They execute, not Mannix, because Mannix only had an affair with her before she was married, so he's okay. But they execute Derham and Culpepper. Their heads are mounted on Tower Bridge, and she gets ferried under Tower Bridge so she gets to see her old boyfriend's heads on spikes. And she's in the Tower of London with Jane Parker Boleyn, who is also being executed for treason. And she's been stripped of all her titles. She's trying to come to terms with her death, practices laying her head on the block for the execution, because she is executed by axe, not by sword like Boleyn was, because Henry is just like furious, and she's beheaded at the age of probably 19. So that happened. So once again, Henry is left without a wife. And at some point, after I think like a couple months, his eye wanders to Catherine Parr, who is a widow of a nobleman. Henry wasn't a huge fan of that guy, but he's dead now anyway. And Catherine Parr is currently kind of interested in this guy, Thomas Seymour, who is Jane Seymour's brother. And they're interested in each other, they're in love, they want to get married, but Henry is like, hey. And as Parr says in her song, it's just like, you don't really have much of a choice. Now, Parr's background, noble lady, not super prominent family, but decently. She had an unusually good education for a woman in that time. She had been married twice before, once when she was like 17. Marriage lasted like, I don't know, a year, and then her husband died. She was kind of like, okay. Married again to a much older guy who just basically wanted a stepmother for his children. She did that. She apparently did a pretty good job. And then eventually he died too. And she's kind of like, okay, yeah. Comes to court, falls in love with Thomas Seymour. Henry VIII starts focusing in on her. Now, Catherine was a hardcore Protestant. Like, she really believed in like all the stuff about like the Bible being translated in English, everyone having access to it, even women, all this stuff. And it's theorized that she married Henry not only because she didn't have much of a choice in the matter, but because, okay, maybe it's like my duty from God. Maybe I can sway him onto the correct path, because Henry, while he had split from the church, still kind of thought of himself as Catholic, but Catherine didn't know that. So they get married. Catherine's not really into it, but she's kind of making the best out of a bad situation. She proves herself to be a very good queen. She does all the correct queenly things. She is a great stepmother to Elizabeth, helps with her education, is the mother that Edward never had. Mary was like a year younger than her, so she wasn't exactly a stepmother to her, but it's just like a really good queen. And eventually Henry, who at this point is getting towards the end of his life and is like kind of looking for one last glory thing, once again goes on campaign in France and makes her regent. And she runs the country for a while. And it's theorized that this could have been a bit of an inspiration for Mary and Elizabeth, being able to see a woman ruling the kingdom on her own without a man. So yeah, things are good for a while. But again, the issue is Catherine is a hardcore Protestant, and she has enemies at court. She has people who are Catholics and they want to go back to the old ways, and hell, she was like hardcore even for a Protestant. Like, the ideas she espoused were very extreme for the time. Completely normal for nowadays, but yeah. So she had people who kind of wanted to take her down. So one thing she would do with Henry a lot was they would kind of debate religion when I guess there wasn't a whole lot else to do. And Catherine, again, she's a smart, headstrong lady, so she would let Henry know what she thought, to a degree. Henry didn't entirely like that. He didn't like being sort of lectured by his wife on religious matters. And Catherine's enemies, one of them being Bishop Gardiner, who's a conservative bishop, kind of starts whispering in Henry's ear like, oh yeah, she's trying to lecture you, she's stepping out of what's appropriate for a woman, and she might be a heretic. And Henry is like, yeah, look into that. But there might have been something a little off about this, because somehow the information that Catherine might be about to be arrested got into the hands of Henry's doctor, who was a friend of Parr's. So of course he went and told Parr, and Parr's like horrified at first, but then is like, okay, I'm gonna live. So she made a plan on how to get out of this. So some people think Henry may have been just trying to like play people against each other and intentionally leak the information, so Catherine may have had a chance to like prove herself, which is still a pretty awful thing to do, especially when it's coming with a threat of death. Like, Catherine's friend, Anne Askew, I think, got tortured and burnt at the stake for having these beliefs, and they were trying to get her to rat on Catherine, and she just wouldn't. So Catherine is like, okay, Henry's angry at me because I lecture at him, and he's like emasculated by that, so she went to him, and she's just like, I never meant to lecture to you. That would just be wrong. Biblically, women are made to be inferior to their husbands and to serve them and learn from them. And all I was trying to do was take your mind off of your ulcerated leg by having conversations with you about religion. And I sought to learn from you by having these discussions. And Henry's satisfied by this. He's like, okay. And when some guards come to arrest Catherine, he's like, get the fuck out of here, like tears up the arrest warrant and all that stuff. So Catherine got out of this with her life. She had to burn a lot of her books and everything to make sure she wasn't discovered, and from then on she was kind of like walking on eggshells, like, okay, I can't say what I want anymore or I might get fucking killed. But yeah, so she comes out of this alive, and Henry eventually, like, is kind of on the way out. He's getting close to dying. He leaves Catherine, and yeah, then just dies. So Parr and Cleaves, the only two wives to outlive him, they do all the appropriate mourning. Edward becomes king, but he's 9, so his government's being ruled by a regency council, which is run primarily by Edward Seymour, who is also Jane Seymour's brother. Different guy from Thomas Seymour. Thomas Seymour also kind of wanted a bit more of that power. And Edward really liked Parr. He really thought of her as his mother. And Thomas, who already kind of liked Catherine, and Catherine, who was kind of annoyed because she had kind of been written out of the will in terms of like, oh, maybe she could have been like Queen Regent or whatever while Edward was a minor. It's like, no, the Regency Council is gonna do this. Her and Thomas, they're like, okay, let's get married. 4 months after Henry dies, which is not a good look for either one of them. And neither one of them end up gaining a whole lot of power because everyone's like, you're not supposed to do that so soon after the king's death. And Edward, who had approved it, had kind of been tricked by Parr into approving it, and he's like, my mom manipulated me, so yeah. So Parr is kind of in a weird situation, living with Thomas Seymour. And she has Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, the one who got her head cut off, and Princess Elizabeth living in the household with her as like sort of her wards. And Thomas Seymour is, he's very interested in Elizabeth. He is very handsy, and yeah, it may have been part of the reason why she never wanted to get married. Kind of a Howard situation, although I don't think it ever escalated to actual sex. And there was a bit of a disagreement of how much of a role Parr played in this. Either she didn't really know what was going on, and she's like, oh, this is just harmless horseplay, or like she actively like knew what was going on, but was like, I've got to be loyal to my husband, so like aided Seymour in his like groping of Elizabeth, essentially. But eventually things got so bad that she just sent Elizabeth away. And, surprise, surprise, Parr is pregnant. So she's like, oh my god, I didn't expect this to happen because I'm like 36 and I haven't gotten pregnant in either of my other 3 marriages. So she's kind of excited for it. And eventually she does give birth. It's a girl, Mary Seymour. but Parr catches the same disease that Jane Seymour caught and dies a couple weeks later of childbed fever. So, yeah, that kind of sucks. And meanwhile, Cleaves is just out living a very, peaceful life. She continues living like that. She has some financial problems throughout her reign because, the Regent's Council doesn't want to give her a lot of money. Edward kind of does, but he's a kid, so he can't do a whole lot. And then, eventually, when Edward dies, and there's this whole succession crisis, Edward wrote, I don't want the throne to go to Mary or Elizabeth, specifically Mary because she's a Catholic and I'm Protestant, so I'm gonna make Jane Grey, my cousin, my heir, even though she has, no right to the throne. So Cleaves accompanied Mary on her, ride into London to take the crown. She was pretty good friends with Mary for a while. Things were pretty good. Eventually, Mary kind of started going a little crazy, and Cleaves was part of a camp that kind of wanted her to marry someone other than Philip of Spain. She read a little too much into that, thought Cleaves was a traitor. Didn't kill her, but yeah, kind of I don't really want you in court anymore. And Cleaves just went off, lived the rest of her life, died at 42, 41, and left a wonderful will where she focused on clearing her debts and mentioned all of her servants by name in the will, gave them special gifts. Just a very nice will. So yeah, that's the story of the 6 wives of Henry VIII. After that, there was Bloody Mary's reign, and then came Elizabeth I, and then the Tudor dynasty ended, and all that. But that's a different story. So yeah. That's my hour-and-a-half long description, this was meant to be kind of Cliff Notes, but whatever, of the lives of the 6 wives of Henry VIII. I hope it was informative, and yeah, hopefully you know a little bit more than you did before. Bye.